So I'm very, very excited to welcome our keynote speaker. So in the past, we've had a Duke 15Q adult now do our keynote speaker. But before I actually introduce you, I want to say how we found Rachel. So Rachel did a keynote presentation at one of the conferences that I attended, and I was completely moved. Like, she's a rare disorder parent, but when you hear her message, it's something that it has changed the way that I think about things. So anyways, I'm just going to stop crying into the mic and just totally introduce her. So Rachel's a TEDx presenter, speaker, trainer, award-winning artist, and the author of the Outstanding Book of the Year award in 2015, the Superpower Baby Project. This exceptional book celebrates the life and abilities of children with chromosomal or genetic conditions and was inspired by Rachel's late daughter, Evie, who was born with a very rare genetic condition herself. In the 2.5 years of Evie's life, Rachel learned a lot about the use of language in the healthcare system and has spent the subsequent years continuing to explore the impact and implications of how it is used by health professionals to positive and negative effect. This book is Evie's legacy, as is Rachel herself, and both have much to teach us about ourselves, how we negotiate conflict, grief, hope, uniqueness, celebration, and a meaningful life. So please welcome Rachel Callender.
Oh gosh, it is such an honor to be here. I honestly think that every conference should open with a parade. That is just the most beautiful way to open, and it is such a privilege to be amongst all of you. Thank you so much, Vanessa. All right, let me get organized. I'm a little bit shaky. I think it's important to cry. You know, often we would never stifle a laugh, but we often feel embarrassed about stifling tears, but I think it's important to release all of the emotions in equal measure. So, tears are very welcome. I'm going to begin with my story. When I found out that art could be a career in high school, my art teacher told me, Rachel, you can study this. You can do this for a living. This was the greatest news of my 15-year-old life. And so from that moment on, I was on a path to becoming an artist. So as soon as I finished high school, I went to university to study a Bachelor of Fine Arts. And the themes that I was photographing, everything in my work was about finding beauty in brokenness. I'd photograph feathers on a muddy puddle or flowers decaying, and I found incredible landscapes, much beauty in these hidden treasures. And it was interesting because a lot of people would say to me, so are you going to be a wedding photographer after you graduate? And I took offense at this, and I was like, no, I'm going to be a real artist, thank you very much. But after I photographed my cousin's wedding, I was completely hooked, and I ended up becoming a wedding and portrait photographer after I graduated. I ended up marrying a beautiful man named Sam Callender. So I called my business Calendar Girl Photography, which I thought was quite clever of me at the time. And I was on a new path. I was a wedding and portrait photographer based in New Zealand, which is where I'm originally from. I now live in Australia. And this was my life. I was capturing love and beauty and celebration and people and community. And it was great. I was traveling the world and I was doing well. And then I found out I was pregnant. And I really had no plans of becoming a parent. I didn't really like children. I didn't think I was up for being a mum. I didn't want to be a parent at all. And I was very artistic, very airy-fairy, as my mother would call me. And I was terrified. And so on this particular day, my husband rang into his work and said, look, I can't come into work today. There's been a family emergency. And that's what it felt like, family emergency. I was pregnant. But over time, as I got used to this idea of my impending doom, as I thought of it, I started to get used to the idea a little bit. And around our 20-week scan, we found out that this little bundle was going to be a girl, and we started thinking about names. And I sat with this new reality, and it started to feel a little bit okay. And when I found myself crying at nappy ads, I felt like, okay, maybe I'm ready for this after all. And then on the 30th of March 2008, Evie Amor Callender was born by caesarean section in the Dunedin Hospital, South Island, New Zealand. And we had a perfect first few hours with her, like relishing in being a family of 3 for the very first time. And then about 6 hours later, when we tried to feed Evie, she didn't latch. She had a really small mouth. She kind of vomited and choked and then stopped breathing. And the nurse just grabbed her and rushed out of the room and upstairs to the neonatal intensive care unit. And then I didn't see Evie or hear about her until the next morning when our paediatrician and our midwife came to see us. And they said that overnight some tests had been done on Evie and they had some really serious concerns about her. They said, look, we think she has trisomy 18 or Edwards syndrome. This condition is incompatible with life. She's got skeletal abnormalities. She's got multiple ventricular septal defects. She's got congenital defects. If she does survive, it's highly likely that she'll be severely mentally retarded. And a lot of you in this room have received words like this, and it's just horrific, you know, the words, the trauma, the language, it's so confusing and subtractive, and I didn't know which way was up or down, and I remember looking out the window and the world didn't make sense anymore. It was like everything had shifted and I couldn't find an anchor point. But I had fallen completely in love with Evie and saw her not as this diagnosis, but a new soul in the world, beautiful and full of potential. And it turns out Evie didn't actually have Edwards syndrome, but something even rarer, which was discovered when they did some further genetic testing. She has partial trisomy 9 and partial monosomy 6. And the doctor said, look, we've never actually seen this before. We have no idea what to expect. We're going to have to wait and see with everything involving Evie and her development. Which again was incredibly difficult. They used the phrases again, chromosome conditions are usually incompatible with life. There'll be severe mental retardation. She's got defects and abnormalities. But over time, Evie thrived and she grew and she developed in her own way. And around 2 years old, which is when these photographs were taken, I started to think that she was experiencing the world a little differently to other people. So every time we drove on a particular piece of road to visit family, we had to drive under electrical pylons. And every time we came up to these pylons, she'd start crying. And it was like a switch went off in her, and we would pass under the pylons and then she'd stop crying. And it would happen so often, and often it would wake her up. Sometimes it would be at night time. And I just didn't know what was going on. And then it was happening in supermarkets or anywhere there were electric sliding doors. And I started to think that maybe she had an electromagnetic sensitivity that was completely unique to her. And so I started saying that she had superpowers as a light-hearted way to describe this particular phenomenon, kind of like a baby Magneto of X-Men or something. And I really enjoyed thinking like this, because when I thought about her deeper, I realized that everything about her was incredibly powerful and unique. Like, she expressed her happiness with her whole body. She had a fragility but a pure joy that drew people towards her. She didn't walk, but she scooted on the floor on her back and was independent. She had extremely strong core muscles. She was so brave, and she handled all of her medical treatments just with grace and dignity. She was a little human magnet, and I loved being her mum. And all of the fears I had before she was born just melted away because she allowed us to live every single day with freedom. It was like the rule book was just completely thrown away when Evie was born, and there was just this intense beauty of relishing in every moment with her. Despite this newfounded language and mentality of superpowers, life really could get to me. You know, I was walking down the street often with Evie, and the first thing that people would say when they saw us was, "What's wrong with your child? What's wrong with her?" And initially I'd kind of brace myself and I'd say, well, she's got partial trisomy 9 and partial monosomy 6 and multiple ventricular septal defects, and she can't walk and she can't talk and she doesn't eat and blah, 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 all of the things. And then the person would kind of glaze over and walk away, and I'd walk away. And in that moment, diversity and difference remained a fearful space. Like I hadn't addressed anything in that space. I had done my child a disservice. I felt horrible when I described Evie like this. But with this newfound language of superpowers, the next time someone asked me, what's wrong with your child? I responded with, well, actually nothing's wrong with her. She has superpowers. And they kind of looked at me a little bit strange. And they said, well, what do you mean? And then I got to reframe that whole conversation. And I'd say, well, we love making up games, and she's got a wicked giggle and all of the beautiful things that I told you before. Like she draws people towards her, and I'm just so proud of her, and she's growing and developing, and she can communicate without words, but just the tone of her voice and a single sound. And then they'd look at her and they'd say, wow, yeah. Isn't she beautiful? Look at those eyes. And because in that moment I had described a human being, that stranger saw a human being. And so that space of difference and fear became one of acceptance and curiosity and wonder. And my child became part of the community because I described her as a child. And I know you're probably familiar with forms, a lot of forms. I think you call them IEPs over here, but we have needs assessment forms. And at one point I had to fill out a needs assessment form, you know, where you tick the boxes of what your child can and can't do, essentially. And this form broke me at the time because I couldn't tick a single question on that 2-page document. And I said to my health providers at the time, you know, I hate this form. This form totally sucks. Do I have to fill out this form? And they said, well, yes, it's quite important. So I said, all right, but only if I can hand in another form, my own form, because I didn't want the people at the other end to gather from the lack of ticks that I'd put on this form that Evie was a child with no value, that couldn't do anything, because that's not who she was to me. And so I made up my own form to go alongside this official one. And I called it the Evie's Awesomeness form. In homage to Kung Fu Panda, which I believe could be one of the greatest movies of all time, just quietly. And I answered 10 of my own questions with big yeses there. And I found that when I answered my own questions, I became so proud of Evie because I could see that she was growing and developing in her own way. And while it might not have been able to be measured on any official document, this was my measuring stick. She was the measuring stick, not some official government policy made up thing. Evie wasn't the problem. I believe the questions were all wrong. And so I loved that I could share this and create this and celebrate her milestones in development. And as you can see, some of these questions are completely random, like, does your child laugh when objects fall near her face? But she did, and I could answer yes, and she loved doing this, and it was a beautiful part of our daily routine, was making up games based on this thing that she loved. And I love this one near the bottom. Can your child do assisted push-ups holding her head up? Yes. Her record is 13 in a row. Good. Go Evie, right? Go Evie. And I've been sharing this literally all over the world with health professionals and parents from a whole range of spaces. And it's interesting to see how the health professionals and providers have kind of picked up on this idea of an awesomeness form. And this slide is a little bit tricky to read, but it's from a speech and language therapist working with children in the rare disease space. And so she's decided that every time she sees a parent or a family with a child with a rare condition, she's going to ask them a few questions in each session that connects to the humanity of their child. So it's not just about the things that are broken, the things we're working on, the things we're trying to fix. She's asking her families, you know, what have you noticed this week that's different from last week? Or what has brought you great joy this week? What have you laughed at? What do you love about your child? And then she's writing these beautiful things as part of the official clinical report. Because as parents, I can only imagine the number of pieces of paper and files that you have that's all about the things that are broken and need to be fixed. And it is exhausting. But this piece of paper has a little glimmer of humanity on it. And it makes such a huge difference to that family because they can trust their health professional because there's a relationship built on love and kindness. And the health professional was saying to me, she said, I love my job more since making these awesomeness reports because I can see that I'm having even more of a difference in this space. Because I'm not limited to seeing development in speech and language, but I'm now seeing development in character and personality in these children. And that's where you find meaning. It's so powerful that just a simple change of attitude and a few different words can make such a powerful difference. Evie's life wasn't a very long one. We had an incredible 2.5 years with her. And for every single day of those 2.5 years, she was completely compatible with life. Just not for as long as we might have hoped. And in her short yet remarkable life, Evie inspired a dream. In my capacity as a photographer, I was thinking, if I felt all these amazing things about my child and really wanted to share them with the world, maybe there are other families out there who can see all these beautiful things, but they don't have an outlet to share and express how proud they are of their children. So I went on a mission all around New Zealand and I photographed 75 families and I made a book out of it called the Superpower Baby Project. And this book celebrates the lives and abilities of children in New Zealand with a whole range of chromosomal and genetic conditions. And it was one of the most happy times of my life photographing these kids because the parents, they shared such beautiful wisdom. And it was such a healing space for everyone. I was astonished though because a lot of the parents said to me, we've never spoken positively about our child until you've walked into our home. And some of these children are around 5 years old. And I think that is broken. That is not okay. These poor parents have felt that they weren't allowed to share anything positive about their child because they weren't reaching traditional milestones. They couldn't tick any boxes on a form, so therefore they felt like they weren't allowed to share anything positive about their child. I'm now going to invite you to sit back. I've got a slideshow of the children that feature in the Superpower Baby Project. So snuggle in, get cozy, and we'll see if this is going to happen. you. Like, what do you see in those photographs? Do you see the same things as me? I see joy and life and vibrancy and potential and love and ability. Yeah, do you see those things too? It's so interesting because when the families described the impact that their children were having on them and the community around them, they used words like, we're learning perseverance and unconditional love and kindness and joy and meaning. And I thought, these are some of the things that the world needs most and some of humanity's highest ideals. But the words we've been given to describe difference or disability are words like retarded, abnormal, defective, dysmorphic, mutated, disabled. And I think that these words, they take potential and ability away. And I think the word disability actually shows up the deficits in our culture that doesn't understand or accept or celebrate the very, very varied aspects of humanity. This was a form that was given to me after Evie was born because the doctors had no idea what was going on, and they thought that this might help me. I don't think that they should have actually given me this form because it was supposed to be a diagnostic tool for them, but this is what they had. So they gave it to me and sent me off home and said, good luck. And this form terrified me. I didn't understand 80% of the words on this document, and the ones that I did were horrific. And I invite you now, if you feel comfortable, just to close your eyes and imagine drawing what you hear me describe. The nose is long, fleshy, slightly beaked. The eyes are deep-seated. The mouth is small and triangular. The chin is small and receding. The ears are relatively large and square with abnormal folding. The neck is short with redundant skin folds. The trunk is asymmetric, the right side being more prominent. The extremities are thin and the fingers and toes unusually long and thin. She has a weak, hoarse cry. The tone is poor. She has stereotypical writhing movements of the arms and legs in an avoidance manner. The main features of this syndrome include mental retardation, microcephaly, a prominent forehead, a prominent nose, and then I didn't understand any of the other words. But would you have drawn, if you had an imaginary piece of paper, some kind of bird pterodactyl dinosaur creature? Like some kind of monstery thing? Would you have drawn a human child? Probably not. This form described in such negative detail the features that I loved dearly about my child and saw so much beauty in. And I think if these words are spoken over a person long enough, they start to believe that that's who they are. But you can't be diagnosed with your identity. That is something that is absolutely unique and special to each individual. And no medical diagnosis can ever take that away. And I know it's hard, and I spent some time yesterday going through this with in the science workshop. And I'd love to share this with you in the hopes that it can help somehow. I believe that language falls into one of these quadrants. We have the positive and negative axes and the jargon and formative axes. And over here we have the positive jargon quadrant. So this is language that is quite fluffy. So you guys might recognize it, people are very well-meaning and they want to be kind, but they say things like, God only gives special kids to special parents. And you're not feeling very special often in this space. You're feeling overwhelmed and isolated and terrified. Like everything has changed. You're grieving. You're not feeling special. It's terrifying. Or things like, it could be worse. Stay strong. I don't think anyone should have to stay strong. I think you're very allowed to fall apart whenever you need. And down here we have jargon informative. And I think this is where a lot of the medical language just naturally sits. It's its own language. And when you don't speak medical language, it's incredibly confusing. It takes time to learn a new language. I remember a time when a pediatrician came to see us to give us the new diagnosis of partial trisomy 9 and partial monosomy 6. I'd never heard the word trisomy before, and I honestly didn't even think it was a proper word. I was like, what is he even talking about? That doesn't even sound real. That's a stupid word. So weird. And then he tried to explain why this had happened in Evie, and it turns out that I have a balanced translocation myself, that I didn't know that I was carrying. He'd come to give us some genetic testing results. And I got so stuck on some of his words because I knew that he was a very important man, and all I had to do was just focus and listen and try and understand him, because he only had a few minutes and I better just understand what he had to say. But I'd been in hospital for 2 weeks. We had tests after test after test. I was exhausted. And so he was trying to explain the nature of chromosomes and how they split. And what I heard out of all of the jargoniness that he was talking about was the short arms. So I thought he was saying that Evie had short arms, which was so confusing because to me her arms looked beautifully long and I didn't know what they were going to do. I know people who live with no arms, and he just seemed to be stuck on this short arm kind of thing. And then he used a library book metaphor to explain why I was okay and Evie wasn't. And he said, Rachel, your body is like a library with hundreds and hundreds of books. And in your body, the chapters of some of the books are missing. So you've ended up with too many chapters of Game of Thrones over there in Pride and Prejudice, which I think would make an extremely crazy book anyway. And Evie has ended up with not enough Pride and Prejudice and too much Game of Thrones. And I was just thinking, I don't even know what he's trying to say anymore. I'm still stuck on the short arm thing, and now he's talking about library books, and I'm just so confused. And so he finished his spiel, and I was thinking, gosh, I just don't understand what has been said. And then he said, do you have any questions? In a way that made me feel like, you better not have any questions, because I've got 100 million other things to do right now. But I was brave, and I said, look, what are you going to do about Evie's short arms? Because he seemed to make such a big deal about it. And he said, well, nothing, they're fine, and then walked out the door. And in that moment, I just felt stupid. Like the biggest dummy. I just felt so stupid. And on top of feeling isolated and afraid and traumatized and upset and grieving, being stupid on top of it was just unbearable for me. So I internalized all of these emotions and I threw them back mentally at him, and I decided, I hate this doctor. Hate this doctor. Because he makes me feel stupid. And so every time he came to explain anything to me, I just had this invisible wall where I would nod and smile, but nothing he said ever landed. So all of his expertise was completely wasted on me because I was protecting myself emotionally from him. And this happens so much in the medical space between a health professional and a parent. And then we have informative negative language. It might be medically relevant, but it's brutally destructive. Words like abnormal, defective, retarded, dysmorphic, mutated, very subtractive, deficit-focused words that take away the humanity of a person, incompatible with life. Like even if a child is born without air in their lungs, they are still to be celebrated and acknowledged. They have been somebody's dream, somebody's hope. They're not simply incompatible with life. But there is hope. There is a positive, informative quadrant, and this is language and communication that is empowering. And I'm so grateful to have received some of this kind of communication. And the very first was from my clinical geneticist. And the first thing he said to me when I sat down in his office, he said, Rachel, what do you know about chromosomes? And I said, honestly, I couldn't even draw you one. And so he sat there for 30 seconds drawing away. Oh, here we go, drawing away. And then I'll use my little thingy. And I'm like, oh my goodness, I see now, the short arm. was amazing. It was a light bulb moment that connected me to a whole world of language that I didn't understand, but I had grasped the concept. It didn't take him long, but in that first moment when he said, "What do you know about this?" he was establishing my health literacy. He was establishing our ground zero, our base point where everything else would grow. Beautiful, beautiful piece of communication. And I think a better way to say something like life limiting, and I know it's been done, is incompatible with life, is life limiting. Because life then becomes the focus, not the limitations. And to be honest, we all have a life-limiting condition. We're all human beings. We have no idea when our limitations are going to happen, when we will pass away. It keeps everything even and equal. And I think for this kind of communication, we need to ask more questions. Questions like, what are you proud of? Tell me about your child. Who are they as a person? What are you enjoying? What do they love? Who are they? What do you hope for? This establishes kind of a connecting point of a vision for a future, a family's values. And for me, when somebody asked me, what do you hope for Evie? And I dearly wanted her to have independence. And this was how she got around. She scooted on the floor on her back. But because she was nearly 3 at the time, people were saying, oh, she needs to be standing, she needs to be standing. So they gave us a metal standing frame. And it looked archaic. It had metal straps, and she had to sort of stand in the corner and do nothing. And I just hated putting her in it, and she would cry. And I thought, this isn't quality of life. This isn't Evie. This feels just abusive. I hate putting her in this piece of equipment. And so I tried to kind of figure out a way of making this movement, her scooting movement, safe. And so we'd been given a plastic bath seat at one point, and I thought, well, maybe I could put skateboard wheels on it and she could sit in it and then scooch along the floor. It turns out that wasn't very safe, but I was trying to think of ways of allowing this movement to happen. Because what was happening was she was wearing the back of her hair out every time she would do this, so much so that her scalp was bleeding. And then eventually my health professional realised that this was important to me and for Evie. And so she started thinking of ways to help. And she said, I know the guy that makes the headgear for the All Blacks. And in New Zealand, this is a big deal. I don't know if anyone out there knows about the All Blacks. Maybe. I kind of divide the room when I talk about All Blacks. I see that fist pump. And so she rang this guy, and he made her this tiny, tiny version of the soft headgear. And Evie loved it. And so we could just do this. She would scoot around to her heart's content, completely independent, completely free, and it was beautiful. And then eventually we got her in a standing frame that allowed her to move around and jump about, and it wasn't some kind of archaic piece of hideousness. And then the last question, what are you afraid of? And I think when we are allowed to be vulnerable like this, when we are able to share our deepest fears, that's when I think help and hope can come in the strongest forms. And when some health professionals listened to my fears, there was freedom and hope. Because I was so afraid of Evie vomiting and choking and aspirating and not surviving, because this is what put us in hospital most months. I don't know how many times I ended up calling the ambulance in my time with Evie as her mum, in desperate situations where she's blue and floppy. I said, look, I'm so afraid that I'm not going to catch this. What if I fall asleep? And they said, Rach, we'll send you home with 2 pieces of equipment. We'll upskill you. We'll send you home with an oxygen machine and a sucker machine. And as soon as this happens, you can suck all the goo out and shove the oxygen on her and buy yourselves a few extra minutes before the ambulance arrives. And do you know what happened? This actually kept us out of hospital 9 times out of 10. Because we were able to manage this by ourselves at home. And so we didn't have to go into hospital. She could recover, and we knew her so well that we knew when she was okay. And in them listening to me, to my deepest fears, it actually reduced the cost of care, which is a big deal for hospitals. They want to tick those KPIs, especially in this space. But them really hearing my fears and acknowledging and coming alongside with their expertise was the most empowering thing that they could have done. I show you this photo because it is one of my most favourite of my life. This is me scattering Evie's ashes in the most beautiful lake in New Zealand under the tallest mountain, Mount Aoraki, which means cloud piercer. And in letting Evie go in this way, I found freedom and joy and so much meaning. And I see this as a metaphor in this space. When we're given a diagnosis, there is a death. There is a death of the child that we had expected. And I think we need to acknowledge that, and health professionals also need to acknowledge that when they're delivering a diagnosis, they are killing a dream, another child. But there also is a rebirth. They also need to acknowledge the life that remains in the new child that we have been given. The hope and the potential and the beauty and the meaning in that new life. But it takes time, and it's a process, and we need to be gentle and kind with each other. And our language and our words really do matter so much. It has been such a privilege to be among you this morning, and I can't wait to meet more of you over the course of the day and tomorrow when we have our parent workshop. I have copies of the Superpower Baby Project book available if anyone wants to have a look. I want to thank the sponsors so much for bringing me all the way over from Australia, and it has been so beautiful to meet new friends and old friends. I feel so at home in this room, and it is just so full of meaning and potential and power and beauty, and it is, once again, it's my privilege. Thank you so much for having me.